Welcome to the Financial Freedom Hour. This is John Brinkley. You are listening to KDUX Web Radio, broadcast live from Richland College in Dallas, Texas. We are the voice of Richland College. The City of Dallas's Office of Homeless Solutions is currently having meetings throughout the city to get feedback on its most recent proposal. The final meeting is tonight at 6:30 p.m. at the Pleasant Oaks Recreation Center if you would like to hear about the proposal and provide feedback. I attended the meeting on August 6th at the Timberglen Recreation Center in North Dallas. Monica Hardman, the recently appointed director of the Dallas Office of Homeless Solutions, underwent a trial by fire as she could barely begin her presentation without being interrupted by numerous opinions offered by the audience. If she was looking for audience participation, she certainly got it. She tried to talk about her department's plan for increasing shelter capacity, providing more emergency shelter resources, transitioning people out of shelters into permanent housing, and increasing the supply of affordable housing. Most of the homeless resources are concentrated in Dallas's core. Collin County is especially sparse with resources. Hardman's proposal to decentralize the resources by utilizing recreation centers for temporary shelters was a non-starter with the Dallas City Council recently. Just how many homeless people are there in Dallas? Each year, local organizations that receive federal funding conduct a census in the latter part of January. In 2018, the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance, MDHA, counted 4,140 people living homeless in Dallas, with 1,098 unsheltered, 1,927 in homeless shelters, and 458 in transitional housing. The count increased from 3,789 in the prior year, an increase of 9.3%. People living on the street increased by 24% to 1,341 compared to the prior year, when the count was 1,087. It increased 269% compared to 2015, when the population was just 363. How does homeless in Dallas compare to other cities? We combine the top 30 counties by population with counties with the highest population of homeless in 2017 and divided by the total population of those counties to determine a homelessness rate. The highest rates of homelessness overall are in Washington, D.C., New York, Denver, San Francisco, and Boston. Although these cities have the highest rate of homelessness, with the exception of San Francisco, they do a pretty good job of sheltering their homeless population. If you look at cities with the highest rates of unsheltered homeless, the picture is very different. San Francisco has the highest unsheltered homeless population, followed by Los Angeles, San Jose, Seattle, and Honolulu. When compared to the national average, Dallas County is slightly below average for both overall homelessness, 0.14%, compared to the national average of 0.17%, and unsheltered homelessness at 0.04%, compared to the national average of 0.06%. MDHA is the so-called Continuum Care Agency for Dallas and Collin County. The U.S. Department of Housing provides funds for homeless programs through the MDHA, which coordinates the funds with other local agencies. One of those local agencies in Dallas is CitySquare, located near the intersection of I-30 and Malcolm X Boulevard. There they have a workforce training center, a food bank, and the cottages of Hickory Crossing, a collection of tiny houses that shelter some of the most challenging of the homeless population. About 42% of CitySquare's funding is from public sources, with the remaining funds donated by foundations, individuals, churches, and companies. CitySquare refers to the people they help as neighbors, not clients. I sat down last week with Edd Eason, who manages health and housing solutions for CitySquare, to talk about homelessness in Dallas and affordable housing. He talks about the importance of, quote, housing first, unquote, in public programs that address homelessness. According to HUD, quote, housing first is an approach to quickly and successfully connect individuals and families experiencing homelessness to permanent housing without preconditions and barriers to entry such as sobriety, treatment, or service participation requirements, unquote. Ed talks about the importance of a living wage in preventing homelessness and notes that most of the people helped by CitySquare are working, but simply don't earn enough to afford housing. He echoes comments made by the former director of MDHA, Cindy Crane, who in her 2018 State of the Homeless Address stated that poverty alone is not the only driver of homeless, but is, quote, profoundly correlated with race, unquote. In Dallas, African Americans are a disproportionate share of the homeless population at 66%, which is consistent with national trends. Ed makes the point that the private sector isn't equipped to provide affordable housing. Creative community solutions are necessary if we are to increase the supply of affordable housing. At the end of the interview, Ed took me on a brief tour of the cottages at Hickory Crossing, and we talk a bit about what they replaced in the community.
We're a mid-sized nonprofit. We have programs that are all aimed at addressing the issues of poverty all over Dallas County and beyond. My particular area of focus is health and housing, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Health and Housing. So most of my life is spent working with our teams here at CitySquare to provide housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. And but the broader work that we do at CitySquare really has to do not necessarily with homeless people, but just people living at or below the poverty line in Dallas County. Most of the neighbors, we call them neighbors, not clients, most of the neighbors that we assist in our various programs are working, many times working 2 and 3 jobs. They just don't make enough to live because of the city we live in, some of the inequities that are within this city, beginning with racial divides and racial inequity, and then just the lack of resources in certain parts of our city. Our priorities right now, the real focus, particularly in the areas at CitySquare that I work in, is trying to find more housing for the homeless, and then also trying to work with the city and the county and our partnering community development organization called CitySquare Housing to develop more affordable housing. We have a tremendous amount of construction going on in Dallas right now, building a lot of multifamily housing, but none of it's affordable by the scale. In America today, the average income needed to pay average rent in an apartment is $22 an hour. 42% of Americans make $15 an hour or less, and it's not any different here in Dallas, Texas. And so it's just a matter of people who are working hard, people that have families, people that are trying to be a part of our society here in Dallas, just can't do it for many, many reasons. And so, but I'm focused on housing, finding more of it, and CitySquare developing more of it.
Right. So the city of Dallas recently created an Office of Homeless Solutions in 2017, and they have a 4-track solution that includes increasing shelter capacity, providing temporary shelters for at least 90 days, creating 1,000 units in daycare centers, and master lease landlord incentives. Do you think that Dallas will implement this plan? And if so, will it accomplish its objectives? Do you think it goes far enough, or what are your thoughts on that program?
There's a lot of details that still need to be fleshed out in the plan, but I think the plan is a good one. It addresses the kinds of things that are being successful in other cities that have the kind of challenges that we do when it comes to people experiencing homelessness. So, I mean, some of these tracks are not intended to go on forever. For example, track 2 is being proposed as just a temporary way to help us expand shelter capacity. Ed and track 1 are focusing particularly on that. And those are, somewhat, I see as temporary steps to get us to the end game, which is to create more housing through a landlord incentive program and by reducing risks that landlords have to take whenever they lease to people who have less than stellar rental histories and that kind of thing. But it buys us time, and it builds a capacity within the system to develop the kind of housing we do need later. Is a $20 million bond package enough to develop 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing? No, of course not. There'll have to be many, many other partners. But $20 million as seed money to help the community development corporations and maybe even private investors, if they're interested, is a good plan. You got to start somewhere. This is the first plan we've seen in a long, long time that addressed all aspects of the problem and has different tracks or phases that build momentum on top of one another. So yes, I endorse the plan. I think it's one of the best we've seen.
So you think that Dallas is on the right track? Do you think the homeless problem in Dallas is getting better, or is it getting worse? Because I know the city does these inventories of homeless people. Do you think those are comprehensive? Do you think they're accurate? Do you think the problem is getting better or getting worse?
Depending on what span of time you're talking about. If you're talking about over the last 10 years, it's gotten worse, and then it's gotten better, and then it's gotten worse, and it's gotten a little better. Recently, it's gotten a little worse. So, if you look at it over a decade, I'll tell you this, that having a mayor-appointed commission, having the county and the city together at the table to work on housing, having a new Office of Homeless Solutions, separate and apart from the part of the Dallas housing that deals with code and all the perfunctory things having to do with housing, tells me that the city is making steps in the right direction. What we lack here in Dallas is the political will to put the kinds of resources into these solutions to really make a long-term sustainable impact. You go to other cities like on the West Coast and the East Coast, and you've got county and city governments coming up with money to put into these solutions in addition to what HUD provides through the continuum of care. And we've just got to have more of that. It's not that we don't know what to do. I think we know what to do. It's just that to really build a system that makes homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring, we haven't even gotten started on that yet. We're still, struggling to manage and maintain homelessness. But the continuum of care, the city and the county are coming together in new ways that I've never seen before, and that encourages me.
Can you talk a little bit about the continuum of care agency? I'm not sure that people really know what that is or how that works.
Sure. Back when HUD passed the Hearth Act in the early part of this century, they essentially established a local governing body in every community. In large communities, there would be one continuum of care. And the board of directors for that continuum of care are made up of a sampling of leaders from all over the community, people in education, people in business, people in healthcare, people that are actually in nonprofit organizations that provide services and that sort of thing. The important thing is that the local planning and goal setting, the coordination with the city and the county and the funds they receive separately from HUD and from the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. The idea is for all of that to support a comprehensive plan to address homelessness. And so a continuum of care is just part of that. Our local continuum of care receives about $16.5 million a year from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And how that money is distributed among those wanting to provide housing and services is decided by a subset of that board, and no one on that committee that decides how the money is spent is a recipient of any of the funds. So it's important that there be no conflict of interest, and that the people who comprise the committee that distributes the money not have anybody on it that receives any benefit from it.
Is that funding fairly stable? Has it been threatened with cuts and so forth? And
well, when our homeless problem was smaller, it was slightly larger. I don't think it's ever been much over 17 million, so it's slightly smaller than it was. You've got to realize that cities like Dallas were slow to get into the game of practicing housing first. Housing first was something that HUD told us 5 years ago was going to be required if you were going to be a high-performing continuum of care. Well, Dallas nonprofits weren't used to doing housing first, and it took them a while to get their minds wrapped around the idea, so to speak. But now we have that implemented at our continuum of care. It's one of the performance criteria, and it's also something that the city and the county endorse when they let out RFPs for their grants.
right, what does that mean, housing first? I mean, what is the alternative to?
It means that you are eliminating as many barriers as possible and to get people into housing quickly. You don't screen them out because they have a substance abuse problem. You don't screen them out because they don't have a job. You don't screen them out because they can't pay rent or can't pay a share of their rent every month. You don't evict them because the first time that they are a problem, you've got to have policies and procedures built into your organization that you follow that lower the barriers for getting into housing and provide the kinds of supports that people need to stay in their housing once they're in it. That's housing first. Okay. And housing is an intervention in and of itself. It's been proven that people in the type of housing that ends homelessness, permanent supportive housing, a very low percentage ever return to homelessness again. That's been proven all over the nation. Other things like trying to pre-qualify them or pre-screen them or only take the people who you think are going to do well in housing, that hasn't produced near as good results.
Across the street here we have the cottages at Hickory Crossing. How has that experiment been working? Do you see that as potential for other in that fashion? The tiny house idea.
It's got its place. Is it the what you'd call the main solution or one of the key solutions to solving our affordable housing problem in Dallas? No, it's not. I mean, if used in the right way for the right population with the right kind of on-site services, it's a very good approach to a very sometimes challenging population or a group of people that have some. This facility is the only one in Dallas where you get screened into it rather than get screened out of it. It's the kind of housing that causes or that provides the kind of housing, the kind of services for people that would be costing the city and the county $40,000 a year, and we're able to provide the housing and all of the mental health and services and everything for around $16,000 a year per person. So it's a very cost-effective way but it's a very challenging way, and there isn't enough of it. And to build another one of these, we could probably build it for half of what we built this one. But even if we did that, and there is needed more of this kind of housing for people that are exiting the criminal justice system who no landlord will take, there is a need for it, but its application, I think, has certain limits.
You mentioned that it's saving a lot of money and that the cost of homelessness is about $40,000 per person. How did you what does that include in terms of?
Well, when we started, when we started with all the partners at the behest of the Caruth Foundation 7 years ago or so, we went and took a sampling of what were considered to be high utilizers, homeless high utilizers in the county, who were cycling in and out of the courts, cycling in and out of Parkland, and we ran through their databases what the estimated cost would be for those individuals. When we get to our third year, we'll do a similar study for ROI just to see, if we've impacted. Typically, in a project of this kind, your cost actually goes up the first couple of years, because now you've concentrated a pretty good concentration of some very high utilizers, and now they're receiving some services that they weren't receiving. Whereas you reduce not maybe, but we are reducing the number of times they're returning to the Dallas County courts. We are connecting them better to health care than they were before. So whereas their health care costs may go up in the first few years, what they're costing the county in terms of police services and county courts and jail services, that's going down.
In Oregon, the Oregonian newspaper in Portland did a study and found that 52% of the arrests by police were of homeless people in the last year, even though they comprise no more than 3% of the population. Have you ever undertaken any kind of similar attempt to determine how often homeless people are arrested here in Dallas and what their population is?
I don't know. I don't have those numbers. I know within our own programs, once we get people into permanent supportive housing and we surround them with case management support, just our experiences are that they have less involvement with the criminal justice system. I've got being homeless. You got to realize on the West Coast, states like Oregon and California, Washington, whereas we have on any given night 4,200 persons experiencing homelessness, they have 55 and 75 and 80,000 people, and they have a different situation in regard to their unsheltered homeless. The unsheltered homeless make up well over 50% of their homeless population. Here, our unsheltered homeless, even though it's on the rise, isn't anywhere close to those kind of percentages. So if they're being arrested for things like being in a public roadway or my hunch is they're being arrested for things that are being done outdoors, and I don't know. I don't have anything to base that on, but it's just a different kind of homelessness that we have here with regard to the percentages of sheltered and unsheltered.
I see. How does the economy of Dallas impact homelessness here? Because, the economy, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. What does that have an impact on what you experience, or is it pretty much independent of what's going on in the economy?
Well, of course, when we went through our recession here a few years back, we did see a slight increase in homelessness among older people. Over the 10 years that I've been working, in this area here at CitySquare, I've seen fluctuations from time to time, but they don't seem to me to be as much based on what's happening in the economy at that particular time as they have to do with what's happening in our population in general. For example, most of all the HUD programs, ones that fund the continuum of care, were built on the premise that you'll always have a low number of homeless individuals 18 to 24 years of age, and then as you go and get up into the people who are in their 40s, it'll peak, and then around about 45 to 55, it will start to taper off. We're beginning to see that curve start to flatten as we see the fastest growing segments of homelessness are young adults 18 to 24, and the boomers, as more and more of them lose the ability to earn income and enter the homeless population. So I don't know within my lifetime, certainly maybe within within the next 30 years, I don't know that we'll see totally it come flat, but right now it's it's headed in this direction, whereas it was in this direction. So
what do you think is driving youth homelessness? What's going on there?
It's education, or the lack of access for affordable education for minority students. Used to high school graduation, attaining high school graduation almost assured you of a livable wage job. That's not true anymore. There's young people out there with lots of education that can't find a job that allow them to live anywhere close to the lifestyle that their parents lived. I'm a baby boomer, and even my own children who have college degrees, because of the rise in cost of living, and because of just the way that even professional salaries these days don't keep up like they used to. They're probably not going to end they're not going to go into their retirement years like I am with as much money, and that'll be the first generation that we've ever seen that have experienced that. Well, I say since of my parents, my generation did a lot better than my parents' generation did when it came to being able to amass a certain amount of money over time. I just don't think that the baby busters and the millennials, and who knows on them, but over their lifetimes, there's just not as much earning potential as far as adjusted for inflation.
Are there any policy changes that the government could make at state, local, or federal levels that you think would be helpful in addressing a lot of these issues?
Mandatory ways to raise the minimum wage. I mean, I know that sounds liberal, I know it sounds crazy, but it flies in the face of, free enterprise and competition and all those kinds of things. But we don't have, in our nation, there is such a divide between the extremely wealthy and those who are just below them. I mean, it's crazy.
Well, what level do you think it would need to be raised to in order to be realistic?
I've seen different models, it needs to be adjusted by state. I'm not saying there ought to be some federal mandate across the board. Well, there is a federal mandate across the board, but I think it certainly needs to be adjusted for cost of living in certain parts of the country. So I don't know that I could venture to throw out a number that would necessarily work everywhere. But I mean, just a good comparison point is just that reality that to afford average rent, you need to make $22 an hour. Well, obviously everybody in a household doesn't need to make $22 an hour, but there's got to be a household income that approaches that kind of adjusted gross income, and so we're nowhere close to that.
I've heard a lot of proposals recently for guaranteed income, where you just provide people with a minimum income. Is that something that you think would be effective?
No, I don't, we can get where we need to go without socialism. I really do. Personally, I believe we can get there. Now, when it comes to health care, I'd like to see more socialism. But when it comes to everything else, I think there's a way for free enterprise and capitalism to do it without going all the way to socialism.
What kind of background do you have? How did you find your way into this field?
I started out in public education, went into full-time ministry in a mid-sized church, and finished a degree in master's degree in marriage and family counseling, and then just gravitated toward nonprofit management. That's kind of been my course over the years. So I've spent all my life in some version of nonprofit work or in public education. So, but I've learned a great deal from being around successful, very effective business people. Some of which have been, in leadership here at CitySquare.
Do you think that America is in the midst of a housing crisis?
We're in the midst of a well. It kind of depends on how you want to qualify that. There is not enough affordable housing in major population centers of this nation, yes, and there's no incentive within the private market to develop it and build it, yes. And is it getting worse? Yes. And is the problem acute in certain communities? Yes. It's really acute on the West Coast and in certain pockets of the East Coast. And it's getting uncomfortable here. So, I mean, if you want to qualify it with those, with that, then yes, we are in the midst of a housing crisis. We're not building the kind of housing that I would guess 40% of Americans need. And certainly not in communities like this.
Well, what have you learned in your career that you might pass on to young people today?
I think it's very important that you keep in touch with your prejudices. All of us have them. All of us grew up with them. It's the only way that you can really do this kind of work is to spend, and it's different for everyone, but to spend enough time around those who live in the wake of poverty, and get to know them as people, and get to know that you may never ever be accepted by them as a friend, but you can get to know them at a much deeper level. That's the challenge. We get on with our lives and we become very successful, and we get really caught up in life and providing for the people we love and our careers and all that sort of thing, and we lose touch with a segment of America that it's just invisible to us every day. And so not only does it seem foreign to us, but we form some pretty hard opinions about some things that we see on the surface, and we just assume that everybody's a certain way, or everybody is suffering because of reasons that they could have controlled. And that's not been my experience. that there will always be in anything you do a percentage of people who are going to make bad choices and you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of energy dealing with those bad choices they made and keeping things that they do from affecting the hard work of others. But that's such a small percentage of people. And you don't want to become jaded into believing what people who never spend any portion of their lives around the poor can convince you of. Because if they aren't spending a significant amount of their time around poor folks, they are not getting the full picture. And they're forming some biases and prejudices that just aren't accurate.
You mentioned that racial issues do affect the Dallas community. How do you see that come up in your work here?
Well, you can look at various studies. I mean, the one most recently done by the city will show that 66% of the people experiencing homelessness in Dallas are African American, yet they only constitute less than 25% of our area-wide population. So, I mean, that either tells you that there's a lot of historical issues around poverty and around racial divide in this city that are playing a part, have for decades, or it tells you that there are probably some things out there in regard to how difficult it is for African Americans to access employment and housing that need to be changed.
And it's particularly African Americans, in your experience, not other minority groups.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the mayor's Grow South initiative?
I think that his desire to see more grassroots initiated development in the South, I think it's a good thing, and I think there have been some improvements made, or at least there's been some people that have come to the table that weren't coming to the table to address problems that are going to take a long time to solve than before. With regard to the specifics of it, milestones that it's met, those kind of things, I'm really not well versed on all of it yet. My boss, Larry James, is. He can give you a lot better information than myself. So.
Well, I was mainly interested in what about the issue of gentrification. So if Grow South is wildly successful, it's going to displace a lot of people. I assume because the property values will increase, and what are your thoughts on gentrification, and how does the city, or what does the city need to do, or that just seems to be the conundrum of housing in blighted communities is the fact that there are people who live there, and if you improve the situation, they may not be able to afford to live there anymore.
There are ways to develop what people consider to be blighted communities in a way that where economic opportunity can be introduced and gentrification can happen, but there still be affordable housing that is developed within the community. It goes back to what I said originally. Those kinds of solutions are rarely attractive to for-profit developers. And that's why city and county government has to step in and be very creative and has to come up with ways to fund development that isn't naturally going to happen through the free enterprise system. But you can do it. Cities like Washington, D.C., the state of New Jersey, various places in Connecticut and New York, Massachusetts, they've done it. So if you can develop inclusive community projects within areas, you stimulate economic growth, but at the same time, you create housing and you create enterprise within those communities, whereby people who have historically lived there don't have to leave. You just can't let capitalism take its toll. You have to do some things to mitigate that.
Well, what are some of the most effective ways you can increase the supply of affordable housing?
We're beginning to see some of the tax credit points given for tax credit development within areas that don't have particularly high performing schools. We're starting to see that change in Texas, and I hope that'll continue because requiring that development only happen in the suburbs, you can make it happen in a city that's solved its zoning problems like Houston, but it's probably too late here to make a difference. You're not going to go out there and tell Plano and Richardson and Garland that they've got to take some affordable housing development and allow families that have a lower income level. Those kids go to school with their kids. City governments, city councils in those suburban areas are just you're up against something that Houston doesn't have to deal with, but that doesn't mean that in Dallas we can't develop some affordable housing. It may mean that we have to take over the school in the neighborhood and do some special programs at the school to make it a school where people out in the suburbs would want their children to come, and limit the number of children that can come from the suburbs. But it's hand in hand. You've got to be, and in some cases, you don't have to have a community where you've got a high performing school, because you're going to build affordable housing there for people who don't have children. This aging population that's growing and entering the homeless population, or the 18 to 24-year-olds who can, with more affordable housing, take a lower paying job, or take a job where they're using non-professional skills and that sort of thing.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
One of the most exciting things that we've done is bought the Forest Theater, and we've got a plan to develop that area in conjunction with local leaders in that community, things that they want to see. We don't know that there'll be a big play there for affordable housing, but there certainly will be an opportunity to develop a cultural center whereby young people can have access to a lot of the same arts and media kind of programs that historically kids in South Dallas have been locked out of in other parts of Dallas. So we're looking forward to seeing how that all goes. This is our what we call the cottages at Hickory Crossing. It's 53 units of permanent supportive housing. In other words, individuals who qualify can come live here the rest of their lives if they need to. We have on-site mental health services. There's qualified mental health professionals office right here. and have regular appointments with folks that live in these units. The psychiatrist comes 1 day a week. A medical doctor from the Baylor Scott and White healthcare system comes once a week. They hold clinic, monitor medications, prescribe medications. We have full-time case managers. So what we're trying to accomplish here is we're trying to provide an affordable housing option for individuals who maybe have criminal histories that would make it very difficult for them to take a voucher, say from the Dallas Housing Authority, and find a landlord who would accept it, considering their backgrounds. So we need more of this kind of housing in Dallas. There's people who are putting their lives back together after incarceration, who can't find housing, who have the money to pay for housing, but they can't find it. But here we have taken the people that have the highest propensity for cycling in and out of the Dallas County Jail, Parkland Hospital, high utilizers of services, and we put them in one location and surrounding them with the kinds of supportive services they need. These units now, these are something we're experimenting with. These are made out of storage containers. We can get them made by a manufacturer in Houston for about anywhere from $12,000 to $18,000 each. And they can be set up as single resident occupancy units with kitchen, bathroom, sleeping area, or they can be set up to be temporary emergency shelter with 8 beds, a homeless navigation center, sort of like Track 2 in a city plan. Of course, right now the way the City Office of Homeless Solutions is pitching it, they're looking at using rec centers and public buildings, that sort of thing. But I've pitched them on the idea of using these because these can be moved every 90 to 180 days.
Those are those are the tiny houses on wheels. You have tiny houses on permanent foundations. Those can be moved around.
Exactly. You could stack these in that.
Is this where they used to have like the tent cities and stuff? Is that?
Tent City was underneath that overpass right over there. It's just down the street here.
Yeah, so kind of the same general area.
Same general area. This was just a big, thickly wooded area where probably half the stolen copper in Dallas was exchanged between people who pulled it out of light poles and sold it.
Yeah.
That was what was happening in this little forest. That and a lot of drug use.
Thank you, Edd Eason from CitySquare, for agreeing to that interview and providing us with a lot of information about homelessness and affordable housing in Dallas. I'm John Brinkley. Views expressed on this show are my own unless otherwise stated and do not reflect the opinion of KDUX Web Radio, Richland College, or the Dallas Community College District.